We have come to the most critical moments of chess and throne games in the Eastern European steppes. As you know, with the warming of the weather, the clashes on the front lines of the war between Ukraine and Russia flared up a lot. Both sides are now pursuing strategic moves, but in this regard, the Ukrainian side came out faster than the Russians. The Ukrainian army, led by Vladimir Zelensky, recently launched an incredible offensive operation on the eastern front lines to change the course of the war, with the Russian army targeting the capital, Kiev. The severity of the offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces increased considerably. The Ukrainians targeted Bakhmut, the stronghold of the war, as the first stop of their operation. The Ukrainian army is now taking the initiative by attacking on the Donetsk and Luhansk fronts, which it's been on the defensive for a long time. All fronts from Luhansk to Bakhmut and Solder are in Ukrainian fire control, and Ukrainian forces are blockading Russian troops in Bakhmut for a wipeout. The Ukrainian army has repeatedly hit Bakhmut and Luhansk this week, and unidentified attacks in Crimea and Mariupol have targeted key logistics points of the Russian army. Against these attacks, Putin was very angry and reacted harshly. Russian bombers and warships launched hundreds of missiles in and around Kiev to cover the gap of the unskilled Russian ground army. However, the Ukrainian air defense prevented all the damage by shooting down almost all the Russian missiles. This showed that the Russian army had lost its air dominance, that the Russian forces had given all the initiative to the Ukrainian forces, and that they were completely trapped and besieged in Bakhmut, which the Russians considered very important. So how did the Ukrainian forces take the initiative against the Russian army? And how did the Ukrainian Azov Regiment troops blockade the Russians in Bakhmut? Let's examine the desperate situation of the Russians on the Ukrainian Bakhmut front and the Ukrainian strategies that changed the fate of the war with the latest updates. As oracles, we strive to deliver the most accurate and reliable news around the world to you as quickly as possible. By working hard day and night with our expert staff to support us, don't forget to subscribe and like. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, also known as the Azov Regiment, carried out heavy offensive operations in support of the Ukrainian troops on the northern line of Bakhmut in the past few weeks. In this area is the industrial zone of Bakhmut, and in the industrial zone, besides the Russian troops, the mercenaries of the Wagner group are quite active. However, the Ukrainian armed forces, with the support of the Azov Regiment, broke through the northern line of Bakhmut and managed to advance about 500 meters in this industrial area. After this striking offensive operation, the boss of the Wagner group made posts confirming the progress of the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Russian mercenary group Wagner, released a voicemail saying that Ukraine now has the advantage in Bakhmut, but Russia is trying to reinforce it with elite troops to retake the region. But the offensive operation of the Ukrainians continued rapidly, not only in the northern line of Bakhmut, but also in southern parts of the city. While the crack in special units of the Azov Regiment are supporting the Ukrainian soldiers in the northern line of Bakhmut, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army is located in the southern line of the city. The special forces of this brigade were breaking through the Russian defense shield on the southern line of the city, while the Azov Battalion continued its operations in the Bakhmut industrial area. As a result of the offensive operations of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, the Ukrainian forces managed to advance about 1,000 kilometers along the southern front line of Bakhmut. This was also confirmed by Ukrainian official channels. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malya reported that her army advanced 1,000 meters south of Bakhmut, and offensive operations are still continuing. It's unclear whether the crack in special forces of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade and Azov Regiment, which participated in the offensive operations of the Ukrainian forces, are still continuing their mission at the moment. But considering that the clashes continued on the eastern Ukrainian front lines, the Kiev administration probably did not withdraw these special forces from the front line. The Russian side, on the other hand, continues to drive its special paratroopers, the 4th Motor Rifle Brigade, to the Bakhmut front lines in order not to let the Ukrainians change the fate of the war. However, the Ukrainian armed forces placed the Russians under such a clamp and blockade in Bakhmut that it's very difficult to get out of this trap. In other words, the Ukrainian forces have now managed to create a spider web-like attack corridor near document currently in Bodanivka, about 11 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut. Ukrainian troops are prepared and waiting to advance towards Bakhmut. However, as the Russian-Ukrainian clashes still continue in Bodanivka, it seems that Kiev will keep its troops here for a while. On the other hand, in Kromov, 22 kilometers northwest of Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces continue their operations to hold the entrances and exits to Bakhmut and to seize control of the logistics network in Chasiv Yar, which is 18 kilometers west of the fortress of the war. Ukrainian forces are again trying to provide support to Bakhmut from the full front in Opit, 12 kilometers south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces are trying to break through the Russian defensive lines and push Vladimir Putin's troops further into Bakhmut. Interior, about 15 kilometers northeast of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian armed forces launched an incredible counterattack. The Ukrainian armed forces continues to carry out an incredible offensive operation in Soldau with more than 1,000 soldiers and more than 40 tanks. It's reported that Ukrainian forces carried out 26 attacks in Soldar in just 24 hours. This is actually confirmed by Russian official sources. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced that the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to repel Ukrainian attacks in a 95-kilometer attack corridor stretching to Soldar. Never in a long time had the Ukrainian army carried out such a systematic and all-out offensive operation. Even Russian leader Vladimir Putin did not expect the sparks ignited in Bakhmut to spread over such wide areas. In addition, while the offensive operations of the Ukrainians that we mentioned were captive to the Russians, the statements of the Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin accepting defeat continued to be reflected in the press. Prigozhin announced that the troops of the 72nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade of the Russian Regular Army had fled their positions southwest of the destroyed city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense confirmed that Prigozhin's 72nd Brigade was on the run and reported that they had captured Russian positions west of an important canal adjacent to Bakhmut. In addition, the Wagner leader announced that he wanted reinforcements from the Russian army to prevent the Bakhmut trenches from collapsing within 2 days. The reason for Prigozhin's statements was that the Ukrainians had captured most of the city's high-rise buildings, but the Ukrainian forces had a much more advantageous strategic position than the Wagner troops in Bakhmut. Therefore, Prigozhin announced that he was withdrawing his mercenaries from these areas. In fact, this strategy of the Wagner leader was quite logical because the Ukrainian forces continued to attack heavily, especially on the central fronts of Bakhmut with sniper forces from high-rise buildings. Since the sniper special units of the Ukrainian army seriously attacked the mercenaries of the Wagner group, the Wagner troops were forced to withdraw from Prigozhin in order not to increase the military losses. As you can see, the boss of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, shared all the details of what was going on. Although the Russian administration tried to hide the situation in and around Bakhmut. In fact, this showed us that there was a serious crisis between the Russian administration and the Wagner group, because if you remember, Prigozhin made heavy criticisms in the past weeks, especially targeting Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov. The Wagner leader claimed that his troops were not provided with additional military ammunition and supplies. For this reason, Prigozhin, who attacked Putin and Gerasimov, fiercely prepared the ground for offensive operations for the Ukrainian forces. After this discussion, the Russian authorities had to meet the demands of the Wagner group because Prigozhin threatened Putin and Gerasimov to withdraw Wagner's troops from Bakhmut. But during this crisis environment created by Prigozhin, as we mentioned, The Ukrainians had already completed their preparations for the attack and were waiting for the right moment to start the operations. But will Prigozhin's slowing of the Russian army's offensive speed in Bakhmut go unpunished? Actually, the answer to this question is quite simple. We all know the difficulties Vladimir Putin is currently experiencing in sending troops to the Ukrainian front lines because in recent weeks, Putin has been constantly raising critical issues such as the recruitment of 400,000 additional personnel. This is why the Russian leader seems to have no alternative to the mercenaries of the Wagner group. Therefore, when we look at the current picture, every mistake made by Wagner boss Prigozhin seems to be issues that Putin should ignore. This situation is in the interest of the Ukrainian army. If the friction between the Russian administration and the Wagner group escalates in the coming days, the Ukrainian forces could seize the advantage to a large extent, not only in Glutsk, but also in Donetsk and Luhansk in general. And if this great offensive operation initiated by the Ukrainians continues to progress successfully, we think that Prigozhin will not need to create a new crisis. The factors that ensure the continuity of the great offensive operations of the Ukrainians are seen as the military aid of the Western countries. You can support us with the super thanks button below. How do authoritarian regimes fall? This question is the most important agenda of the world politics, especially in recent years in many countries. Populist politicians are becoming authoritarian. These leaders soon move away from democracy. It is very difficult to end the political career of these leaders who have moved away from democracy through elections. But how? The authoritarian leaders and their political careers. The latest news from Belarus provides an interesting example. We have conducted a comprehensive research on the subject. Let's start if you are ready. Authoritarian regimes are particularly strong in Eastern countries. In Eastern countries, democratic institutions are not strong enough and leaders are very important. This leads to leaders becoming authoritarian in a short period of time. Authoritarian regimes are very strong in countries like North Korea, China, Russia, and Belarus. The situation in Russia and Belarus is particularly similar. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has ruled Belarus since 1994. The Belarusian people do not support Lukashenko, but Lukashenko interferes in the elections and aims to maintain his power. The Belarusian people want to protest against Lukashenko, but Lukashenko is harshly suppressing these riots. He arrests protesters and gives them very harsh sentences. Moreover, he claims that the protesters are traitors. In this way, he is trying to get support from his orders. Lukashenko knows that he cannot stay in power forever because he is old and has lost his strength. The latest Belarusian media reports show that Lukashenko is in a bad situation. Lukashenko is a 68-year-old politician who has ruled his country for nearly 30 years. During this time, Lukashenko has become physically exhausted. Lukashenko is reportedly suffering from many health problems. Lukashenko's health problems were clearly visible when he attended a conference in Belarus. Before we talk about the details of Lukashenko's illness, there is something else we need to talk about. As you know, Putin is also allegedly suffering from health problems. Doctors are very clear about this. So what do Lukashenko and Putin have in common? These two leaders who have health problems have a lot in common. They have ruled their countries for many years. They are old. They have become authoritarian. But there is another reason for the allegations about their health problems. In democratic countries, the public is informed about the health status of the head of state. This is because the head of state can take many critical decisions for these decisions to be taken correctly. It is important that the head of state is healthy, but repressive leaders do not follow such democratic practices. That's why official statements about Lukashenko's and Putin's health are not convincing to anyone. Doctors and experts are closely following the schedules of these leaders and trying to monitor their state of health. Everyone is now sure that Putin is sick after the strangeness of his movements, especially his hand and foot movements, are quite strange. Lukashenko, on the other hand, is thought to be facing a similar illness. Lukashenko traveled to Moscow to attend Russia's victory celebrations. However, he suddenly disappeared during the ceremony. Lukashenko did not wait until the end of the program and was rushed out in the middle of it. It turned out that Lukashenko had difficulty walking while attending this program. The Belarusian leader also looked very exhausted at the moment of the ceremony. Putin and his fellow leaders had one thing to do. They were scheduled to lay flowers at a monument to a soldier about 300 meters from where they were sitting. Lukashenko did not go to lay flowers so as not to walk the short distance of 300 meters because Lukashenko was not healthy enough to walk. This event attracted everyone's attention. Everyone could see that Lukashenko was very exhausted. Dmitry Kusnets, a well-known Belarusian political analyst, shared an interesting fact about this. According to this information, a special dinner was organized for the leaders after the ceremony. However, Belarusian President Lukashenko did not attend this dinner. The Russian delegation was informed about Lukashenko's absence. The Belarusian government informed the Russian delegation that Lukashenko could not attend the dinner due to health problems. After this incident, it was thought that Lukashenko had a problem with his digestive system. However, those who watched the footage of the ceremony realized that Lukashenko was facing a more serious health problem. Lukashenko had a bandage on his arm. His arm was tightly wrapped with his bandage. After this was noticed, Lukashenko's body was examined more carefully. During this process, something interesting was noticed, but there was a later. Lukashenko had makeup on his face. Lukashenko's face was covered with foundation. It is emphasized that there could be two reasons for this. First of all, Lukashenko's face may have been very pale. The makeup may have been intended to make Lukashenko look more vigorous. A professional makeup was applied to make Lukashenko's face brighter. The second possibility is more shocking. It is claimed that Lukashenko suffers from advanced diabetes, which is why he often faints. Lukashenko may have been hit in the face when he fainted. It is said that makeup was applied to hide the bruises on his face. In this way, no scars are visible on Lukashenko's face. The Belarusian government is not making any statement on this issue. This leads to more allegations being made. The people of Belarus are talking about these allegations, especially on social media platforms and Telegram groups. Thousands of people are talking about this issue. Everyone is wondering what exactly Lukashenko's health problem is. The people of Belarus are now waiting for an explanation. As you know, there is a huge tension in Belarus between the people and Lukashenko. Most of the Belarusian people hate Lukashenko after Lukashenko's interference in the election results. The anger of the Belarusian people grew even more. Belarusians think that Lukashenko's political career should end as soon as possible, but Belarusians do not know how Lukashenko's political career will end. Lukashenko's health problems have been a very interesting development for the Belarusian people because throughout the history of the world, the power of authoritarian leaders has usually added to the health problems. It is thought that Lukashenko will have to resign due to his health problems. Lukashenko is the first president of Belarus and he is still in office after the end of Lukashenko's political career. Belarus can democratize. Belarus could also become a country in line with Europe. Lukashenko, in collaboration with Putin, has led his country with anti-Western policies that Russia's policies may change after Lukashenko leaves office. This could completely change the political balance in Eastern Europe. It could lead to a major loss of power for Putin. There are a lot of important developments in the northeast, namely in the Belgorod region. The commander of the Russian Volunteer Corps stated that the second phase of its operation had begun. As you remember, yesterday, the insurgent forces destroyed border guards and security service forces and withdrew before Russian tanks and other reinforcements arrived at Shebekino. The goal of today's raid was to draw this mechanized forces in one direction and destroy them as well. Russian sources reported that today the insurgents attacked the Volkhanka from a new and unexpected direction, namely west of the Siversky Donets River, to draw heavy Russian units. The insurgents used 2 tanks. Geolocated footage confirms that the insurgents entered the town and engaged Russian forces on the territory of the settlement. Other footage shows heavy fighting between infantry units in the residential area. As expected, the advancement was very difficult because today Russians had more forces in the region. Some Russian sources reported that Russian forces conducted an intense artillery strike, destroyed 1 out of 2 tanks, after which the crew of the second tank abandoned an intact machinery mid-fight for fear of being the next target, which prompted all other forces to run away as well. Less prominent sources claimed that the tank was not destroyed but just damaged, and the insurgents even managed to return it to the base while the second tank and the infantry continued their operations. Local residents reported that Russian forces had lost at least 3 tanks already in the first 90 minutes of fighting. Local residents also reported that the insurgents are conducting much more intense shelling, especially in the areas of regional administration and law enforcement departments, which are effectively used right now as bases. However, this is just the beginning. It was reported that the radio in certain areas was hacked and the citizens were informed that this Sunday there would be a referendum and asked to vote for the establishment of the Belgorod People's Republic. Simultaneously, the insurgents imitated preparation for a large-scale attack near Gravearin, which they assaulted last time, and also Rozava, which would be a new direction. This prompted Russians to relocate a lot of forces to this directions, which is exactly what the insurgents wanted them to do. Dozens drone operators identified and tracked the position of multiple Russian columns based only on the available footage. The insurgents struck at least 3 areas of forces, concentrations that together had at least 8 pieces of equipment, including 4 trucks. Due to the active fighting on the approach to Shebekino, thousands of civilians were evacuated. Later, the town was closed and the emergency services stopped helping the locals because they were either dead or busy fighting. Hearing about the possible referendum was the last straw and the town was consumed by chaos. Some people started fleeing, while others took advantage of the fact that the law enforcement was too busy and started raiding supermarkets and even the houses of people who just left. Well, the Russian population went mad because of a lack of protection. The infighting in the Russian army just started a new chapter. This time, Chechen commanders and officials launched a concerted attack on Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin. This attack was seemingly a response to Prigozhin's relatively neutral statement in an interview where he was asked about Chechen forces, and he just said that he's unaware of Chechen units' new positions. And the Chechen forces usually fight for select settlements across multiple directions and do not have one big distinct area under their control. Chechen member of the Russian State Duma, Adam Limonov, called Prigozhin a blogger who is constantly crying about problems and said that Prigozhin doesn't know about Akhmad because he shouldn't know. But if he really wants to know, they could select a time and place and teach him. Akhmad, Special Forces commander of the Alaudi Nov, made a statement as well and said that he has no respect for the Wagner head and that Prigozhin would have been killed for his critiques during the Second World War. This is ironic because the first person who started openly and viciously critiquing the Russian Ministry of Defense was the head of the Chechen Republic, Ramzan Kadyrov. He was the first who called out Colonel General Alexander Lapin for completely failing at his job and running away from the front lines and called for demoting him to private for the massive defeat in the aftermath of the Second Kharkiv counteroffensive. Then Prigozhin started doing the same, which actually united the Wagner and Akhmat forces. Both formations provide an alternative to traditional forces, which is why they tried to gain Putin's favor and therefore gain more power. However, due to the violent protests inside the Chechen Republic and the growing instability, Kadyrov switched sides, likely to receive help from the Ministry of Defense to prevent a coup. That is why the Chechens attacked Prigozhin, likely by the order of the Ministry of Defense. And this makes sense because it happened the next day after Prigozhin viciously critiqued Shoigu, Gerasimov, and other elites for allowing Ukrainians to conduct a massive drone attack on Moscow. So Prigozhin's critique of the Russian Ministry of Defense at the most vulnerable time was the pivotal point and the main catalyst of the growing feud between previously friendly formations, and in order to verify the veracity of such historical events,